Welcome to episode 58 of the Sim Sundays podcast. This week we have sim racing legend, BMW sim racing driver, and founder of Popometer, Nils Naujoks. Nils talks to us all about how he started in sim racing. He gives us another Live for Speed rubber band thrustmaster story, which we've grown to love on this podcast. He gives us his take on the growth of sim racing since 2015, 2016, when it all started to get a bit real. And he tells us about the inspiration and the vision behind his setup and coaching tool, Popometer. Before we dive in, though, just some very exciting news I want to share with you about our podcast. We have a new sponsor, Acetec Sim Sports. Acetec are working with us at Gridfinder and the Sim Sundays podcast on a number of projects over the next few months and hopefully years, including supporting us here on the podcast. So thank you and welcome, Acetec. We're going to have some Acetec guests on the show throughout the year. The Gridfinder sim racing team and us in the office and the Gridfinder development team, we all tried out the Aztec kit at the Sim Racing Expo last year, which is when our conversation started. And we were pretty blown away by the quality of their equipment, especially their direct drive wheels, and their real deep understanding of sim racing and kind of what it means. So I'm really excited here for the team in the office to try out the Forte bundle when it arrives, and we fit it to our Track Racer TR180. And speaking of Track Racer, just a huge thank you to Matt, Johan, and the team at Track Racer for sponsoring this podcast in its first year. I really appreciate the faith you put in this project. We've been using that TR180 day in, day out in the office, and it's just as rock solid now as it was when we first built it. So thank you. Right, let's get on with the podcast. Nils Naujoks, good morning. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Well, we say good morning. We've said it twice now, and I'm very conscious that it is morning. This is an admission on my behalf that this is the earliest podcast I've ever done. And actually, it's like 10 past 9, so it's really not that early. But I feel like usually these podcasts are right at the end of the day, and I've had like 4 coffees by that point, and I'm pumped up. So we're going to get through this together. Are you're a morning person?
I don't know. I'm very rare to kind of describe myself with hard words, I guess. So it depends on the day. I think I know I get stuff done if I get up early, but then again, it doesn't happen too often.
How about sim racing? Like, not to dive straight into the kind of the technicalities of your sim racing regime, but do you tend to prefer to race in the morning or the evenings?
Honestly, to kind of fit it better into your normal life, it would make perfect sense to just treat it as normal work and do it in the morning hours. But of course, everybody else in the team, and I guess it's a thing in most teams, it's a hobby for most people. So to practice together, it's going to be after their work, which means it's in my evening usually. But yeah, every time I'm independent, I actually try to do it in the morning hours, like not 8 a.m. or something, but before noon, and then have already kind of cleared my guilty conscience of having done my practice.
Yeah.
And then I'm freed to do other stuff. That's
Nice.
also important.
Yeah, and I every now and then when I let myself kind of dream of the prospect of one day being, fast enough to be a pro sim racer, I always thought, I definitely think I'd be like more of a morning person. If my 9 to 5 Monday to Friday was just about becoming a good sim racer, I feel like the morning is when you're sharp and you're fresh, and in the evening you kind of get more and more easily distracted, I find.
And it's also just because you still have a lot of day left, and with sim racing practice, you can't make like a clear cut. Let's say I do a 2 or 3 hour session, then I call it a day. You always need that feeling of progress within the session. You can't quite control that that's going to happen within the 2 hours or whatever time frame you give yourself. So it's tricky to do it in the evening because you're running out of day, literally.
Yeah.
And then mornings are better because you're like, oh, okay, if I don't make it until 10, okay, maybe 11, okay, noon would be fine. So that's more easy on you, if that makes sense.
I mean, this is dreamy. I imagine a lot of people listening here who aren't fortunate enough to sim race all day, every day, are probably like, "Oh my god, what a routine!" But Niels, you're sat in your incredible sim rig with your BMW sim racing team jacket on and your Sim Pro trophy behind you, and you run Popometer, which is obviously an incredibly successful setup tool for sim racers, right? So you're all about sim racing, and that seems to be the all you do right now. But tell us what happened before sim racing came into your life. What were you doing before sim racing entered the life of Nils Naujoks?
Yeah, so let's say sim racing is going to have this story arch through my life. Wait, I have to do it like this.
Beautiful.
So I think you probably couldn't call it sim racing back then, but it was 1990s, okay? When my we had a PC in the basement, and I don't remember if it was my birthday or Christmas, but I got a steering wheel, like very early Trustmaster T1. All it has was a rubber band inside to make it recenter. That was the only resistance that it had. And yeah, my father gave that to me as a present. Probably was half a present for himself, because he was in that basement every now and then, for sure. But that got me started with, got me started with driving cars on the PC at the time. And I think what I played must have been IndyCar Racing 1, 2, Grand Prix 1, 2. These were the days, kind of. But it was never serious back then. I was like 8 years old, or 10 maybe. And it was just there, something I did every now and then. And then with we got older, school, blah, blah, Counter-Strike became a thing with my friends. And we played that a whole lot, really. And actually, I spent much more time there. And at one point, I was also doing some BMX and mountain biking, probably 16, 17 or something like that. And I did an unintentional backflip.
Oh, yikes.
That didn't go too well. So I broke the collarbone. And that kind of, it's very weird that forces me to do sim racing. But I kind of couldn't use the keyboard. But I could drive one-handed. And
I love that, like, not gaming just wasn't an option at this point.
Yeah, I don't know. So yeah, I dug out the steering wheel and got going. And at the time, it was on the Grand Prix 4 forum or something, where one of the guys was advertising Live for Speed. Not Need for Speed, but Live for Speed, so an actual sim. And I just drove a couple laps, and I mean, the sound in that game is still like computer generated, so they don't have audio recordings or anything. It's literally generated from what the engine layout is. It sounds awful, but just the driving was so different to everything I had before, where you're like, yeah, that makes a lot more sense, and this is a lot more difficult. And I think this difficulty was so captivating for me. And they had the leaderboards, and they got me totally hooked. And I probably spent the next 3 months just chasing that world record. And I think it took a year until I had it.
Oh my goodness. That's nuts. A Live for Speed, I feel like, is a bit of it's like a cult within sim racing. If you know what Live for Speed is, that's a tick in a lot of sim racers' box that you've at least heard of it. And if you've played it, then you're like, okay, one of us. We actually still have some Live for Speed leagues running on Gridfinder. So people, like, they could race on ACC, they could race on AC or iRacing, but they choose to race on Live for Speed.
And I can understand that.
I think because of the emotion, right?
It's probably just because you're thinking back of, I don't know, different sim racing times. But I think it's also maybe because it's not that competitive. It's just much easier to grid and go. And now everything, if you go to iRacing, you always have to be prepared. You can't just go into your week unprepared, try to have a race, because you're losing rating right away.
Yeah.
And the same on ACC, without preparation, or at least having a brief idea of the track car combo and the setup ready, you don't even have to start. Like, even I would lose rating if I was forced to start with the aggressive preset or something, just because the level is so high.
Yeah.
So that maybe helps or some of those games that aren't as popular, where you can just
jump in,
pick it up, nothing on the line.
Yeah. So you're in your teens, Live for Speed. You're grinding the leaderboards on Live for Speed. What next?
ESL at the time, they had Counter-Strike and FIFA, things like that, and it was very early days. Like, their broadcasts were worse quality than your random podcast, for example. It was much more ghetto style, so to say. And so they were just getting going, tapping into everything that was there gaming wise. So they also picked up sim racing, and it was Live for Speed, because there was some connection of people, and just how it goes. And they started a pro series in that as well, which I just immediately qualified. I think I joined the second season, so they had it going already for half a year or a year. And yeah, I think I did win it in the first year. But yeah, but it was the level of the day. Just it were mostly, I don't know, late 20s, mid 30s people doing sim racing or so. And
That seems
they
older than the crowd that are racing now. Like if we think back to where the esports, the Fanatec arena in the Nürburgring last weekend, what do you think the average age of the drivers that you were racing was there? I'd say it's probably early 20s, if not late teens, right?
definitely around that. Yeah, I'm kind of distorting the average there, but I guess without me it would be 20 max. I don't know. Yeah, could be.
That's interesting
No,
that the age seems to have come down. Why do you think that is?
are just more accessible, more popular,
Mm,
just more eyes on. I don't think when. I mean, it was Gran Turismo 1 times when I started,
yeah,
and the PlayStation was new, so being able to do racing games in general just wasn't a thing until a certain time. And then, of course, with gaming growing and Gran Turismo being one of the most sold games ever, probably, and coming with a PlayStation like by default,
yeah, nuts.
people know there's racing, right? It's not that alien to do it. Um, and maybe I don't know. I don't think PCs got more affordable. Like if I see what people need these days to
Oh my
run
goodness,
those sophisticated games, it's not that. And
no.
the equipment certainly did get more expensive as well. So I don't think that's the main factor. So it must be just that there's a thrill about it still.
It's interesting, isn't it? I wonder how much of an impact the Gran Turismo franchise has had on sim racing, because a lot of sim racers now would kind of roll their eyes at Gran Turismo and say it's not a sim, it's an arcade, and yeah, we'll put that aside. 'Cause I think that frustrates me a little bit. But the interesting thing is that so many people know Gran Turismo, like gamers know Gran Turismo, not motorsport fans, not sim racers, but gamers, and even people who aren't gamers. Like my parents, if I said, "Do you know what Gran Turismo is?" they tell me that it was a racing game, and even more so now that the film has come out. But I think back to those early games in Gran Turismo, the first racing game I ever played was Tokka 2 on the
Hmm.
PlayStation. But then I think back to Gran Turismo, and you look if you compare Gran Turismo 2, especially with Gran Turismo now, they're pretty similar in terms. Like, they've even got the same like world map layout and the B licenses and the A licenses, and you know it's they kind of nailed it first time, and then for the last 20 years have been going. How do we make this better? Just better graphics, I guess.
It's true. I think the general concept of the game is still the same, right? You grind up to drive faster cars eventually. But of course, the physics got way more sophisticated. I guess the experience is cleaner,
Mm,
sharper, more immersive in all aspects,
yeah.
most likely. I mean, I've heard or seen people praising the VR implementation of Gran Turismo, for example, despite the whole thing being what, a 60 FPS,
Mm.
which would freak me out on the PC. But I guess if
Somehow it
they get
works,
that
right?
right, then it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I did a 4-hour endurance race on Gran Turismo 7 last month around Le Mans and an LMP, and it went through like a night and rain cycle, and
Hmm.
it was really really good. Like I race a lot of ACC, and you can definitely tell the difference, but like it was really enjoyable and really immersive, and it was a real kind of I still felt the same racing experience, you know, practicing for the race, the qualifying, and then being on the grid, and then the light changes and the
Yeah.
weather changes, like as a pure spectacle to enjoy, just as good as everything else, if not maybe slightly better,
Yes.
because it's just easy.
Yeah, I think so. I had my talks with Aris. Like I interviewed him for the magazine we did last year, for example, and he was he was repeating the message that for him it's not just about nailing the physics, but the visuals are just as important to
Mm,
really make it immersive and give you exactly that perception that you were just describing, that it drags you in and yeah, kind of just gives you that feeling of so many of your environment and surrounding changing that I don't know, just makes it better, to use a simple word.
well, I think and we'll carry on with your timeline, right? We're gonna pick this up, but I think in terms of why Aris is right there about, the graphics being just as important and it having to drag you in, is that it's a simulation. Now, I worked out recently that I really love simulation games. Everything from Roller Coaster Tycoon as a kid to even things like Age of Empires 1 and Age of Empires 2. You're simulating that reality. I actually kind of like mil sims as well. Recently, I've got into like Hell Let Loose, and I'm dabbling with Armor. Like I realized that I really like simulation, where you're simulating something that actually exists. I hate fantasy games. I can't stand anything with magic and monsters. Not my thing at all. And I wonder if that's the key to like a successful sim, is really building in the immersion that people can actually recognize. So getting perfect physics on a car, unless you are a racing driver, which is basically negligible in terms of the number of people who are sim racing, you don't actually know whether those physics are true to life or not. You can just watch YouTube videos of somebody like Jimmy Broadbent, who's doing a bit of both, saying it feels like it or it doesn't feel like it. Whereas you can actually see things with your eyes. So when you play a game and you see the spray coming up off the tires, or you see the light coming through the trees as you're taking a bend, or you see the way that the light catches a curb, it all adds to that sense of immersion, and it's one step closer to you genuinely feeling like you're there and you are a racing driver. And I think a lot of sim racers, if they're honest with themselves, love doing more than just casual racing, because they love the idea of, right, I'm preparing for the race, I've got practice, there's a qualifying server up where I'm going to be qualifying with everyone. Then even some of these leagues that I've been in the past, they'll do like a race briefing where somebody will talk through track limits and blah 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 blah, and it makes you feel like you're genuinely about to start a real race, and you sit on the start line and your heart starts going because you're nervous about turn one, because now you have all of this emotional baggage behind the
Yeah.
race because you've done all of this lead up to it, right? Like, and I feel
Yeah.
like that's the bit that really makes a sim work.
It's also what sets us apart, I think, from other games. Of course, I guess if you play Counter-Strike on a professional level as a team, then of course you have lots of dedicated preparation, finding new positions and whatever you can do on the map and angles and whatnot. But for me, always Counter-Strike was, let's start a game, right? So you group up, then you press start and you play, and then you play again, you play again. There isn't this like 20 hours of preparation before going into an actual race, right? And that's I guess where as you say, the emotional baggage just changes it completely when everything is on the line all of a sudden, and so much went into it.
You just care a lot more.
Absolutely. I mean, you don't want to put that all to waste. I mean, the disappointment is just insane when something goes wrong first lap, especially because it's the biggest pain. If you have to chase your tail for 12 or 24 hours, it's like not fun at all. You really have to make it work from the start, because catching up is horrible because it's so difficult, because it really needs other people's mistakes. There's just nobody who's just faster and makes up for these kind of things. But you were saying about the immersion thing, and I just recently did the AMS2 review video, and then just going back to the comments now, where someone said, okay, but if you're so much into the physics, what about Race Room, for example, which I guess focuses a lot of physics, is probably well developed because they're so old. So
I love their front wheel drive. The front wheel drive cars in Race Room, I really enjoy racing.
Yeah. So I guess the driving experience in Race Room is fine because they really develop this further and further and further over what now, 50? I don't know. The game feels 10, 15 years old. I don't know.
It looks old.
But the thing, that's the point, right? Because even if it might be good from a driving experience, just the raw driving experience, nobody's playing it. Or at least in comparison to other games, it's very below, in terms of player numbers, just below everything else. I think R Factor is as low or something, or Grid 3. I don't know. But just nobody's playing it because I think it's just lagging behind in every other area. Maybe even sound is good, but if it's not graphically captivating people, then they don't seem to play it. Like you want to have that change of finding your breaking point in the night or something. You're relying on this one spot on the track, and then it changes as it becomes darker, and then you kind of have to adapt, and there's a new challenge. And then the weather comes. Is there rain in Race Room? I don't think there is.
I don't think I've seen any rain in Race Room. I watch a lot of Race Room streams, and I don't think I've ever seen rain.
Yeah, so there's lots of things just missing from that game. Even if the physics might be correct, it doesn't seem to be enough for people to actually play it.
Well, I would suggest that maybe, if my theory is right and that people love sim racing because they love the simulation of reality and they like to feel like they're genuinely there, then if you have bad graphics, then you're constantly being reminded that it's a game. Like
Yeah.
visually, subconsciously, you're constantly getting all of these triggers saying this is a game, this is a game, this is a game when you see bad graphics.
Yeah, like if you have a HDR monitor and you do ACC on buffers and the sun is coming up over the mountain, it's horrible. Like you're like moving in your chair trying to look past the sun, but of course you can't because the image doesn't respond to yourself. But that's what you're trying to do, and you don't get that in a game that isn't graphically sophisticated.
And what's quite interesting, something I noticed in Monza at the first round of SRO, I was walking around the arena, I was looking at the guys practicing, and I noticed that a lot of people have turned off a lot of the graphic enhancements, especially things like
Yeah.
shadows. So as you get good, you kind of go through this arc of you're always trying to improve your equipment and your settings to make it look as real as possible, as real as possible. And then when you kind of get to the pro competitions, it's like, right, now I need to, it's almost like that slider that you have on the end video where it's like performance
Yeah.
versus quality. And all the sim racers move that cursor away from
Yeah.
quality towards performance.
Yeah, they're just trying to exclude factors that could be distracting, right? So the sun glare is nice, but distracting. It makes it harder to get your corner perfect every single time. Makes it harder to find the breaking point every single time, and it's just you're taking all these things away, right? Like they crank up the brightness at night, so they don't really have to adapt to the night and don't actually have a challenge from that. Something maybe they could regulate, but people just would find a way around that. So if the option isn't in the game,
yeah, and I was just about to ask that
monitor.
question. Would you prefer it if games had like I don't know, let's call it an esport mode where you can't turn this stuff off? So and when I'm saying esport mode, I kind of mean the opposite of what the esports guys are doing right now.
Yeah.
So esport mode isn't completely optimized and remove all the nice graphics. Esports mode is like, okay, there's now a little symbol in the corner so that the stewards walking around the arena can check that you're in esports mode, and you can't turn off the sun glare and you can't turn off the shadows because we're meant to be
I think in the
racers,
beginning
right?
they had that in SRO where they were trying to make sure that everybody has the same settings, but there's 500 settings or so. And then it just becomes so finicky for them to actually check, and then they need more staff, and then it gets more expensive.
But
and then they can't run it at all.
Could implement a mode that at least ensures that a few
they could probably make a version of the game where you just don't have the graphics options available. That could be something for the on-site series, but of course online your hands are tied. You don't have control over the entire PCs and all that. So just it's a good idea, but I guess as long as everything is still online, which honestly I prefer because it is what makes sim racing so accessible. And if you go on site, you just crank up the price tag. In the end,
that's a really good point, isn't it? I'm kind of torn on it because a lot of the teams, well, most of the drivers in that arena, I don't think any of those drivers are paying themselves to get to the arena. So it's still just as accessible because the drivers can still practice at home in their rigs. They can do, in our case, in the SRO, in the case of SRO, they have the sprint series, the European sprint series, which is online. So they can still do that. And now that sim racing has grown, you have these organizations which are paying for the team members to get there. So from a driver's point of view, from a gamer's point of view, I would say that it is still as accessible. But I guess for the teams themselves, there's a cost of flying people out there and the accommodation, the entrance fees and whatnot. But I would argue that it does add to the immersion, being able to see the other drivers. And at the end, everyone stands up and, I saw you at the end of the last race, you stood up and a couple of the other drivers came over and congratulated you for, for getting a podium. And, that really adds to that sense of being a real racing driver. Which is kind of
totally. I do like being on site there with the people if the race goes well. I hate it if it doesn't. But no, it's generally it's nice to have that. Not for me personally, but also I guess for the viewers to see faces, because of course people know they're the people who are streaming, and like I don't know, everybody knows Dara and Jardier and whatnot, and Boothby or so, right? They have a face, but a lot of people just don't, and I think this is where then those on-site events could make a difference if they actually pointed the camera at the people and not just the top three.
Yeah.
But there's still, the broadcast is so tidied up already and narrowed down. Like, we don't see the qualifying, right? They start right with the grid into the race, just to not lose any people with boring stuff or whatever. Just right into the action, keep it short and simple, and then
well, that's the challenge we have as sim racing, isn't it? It's because we're simulating a sport that ordinarily has longer matches. It's not like CS:GO where a round could be over in a minute and a half, 2 minutes, right? The matches are always going to be, I say matches, the game, the spectacle, the round. I'm comparing to like classic esports. It's always going to be at least 15 minutes, right? But then if you look at what Formula E and ESL R1 have done recently, they're starting to learn the lessons of other esports and do these quick fire heads to heads and these quicker races, because they know that people, SRO is an hour-long race, right? So I imagine there's a lot of churn through people that will kind of dip in and out throughout the race. They might not necessarily watch the whole thing, or they've got it up on their monitor, but they're actually doing something else as well. Whereas with CS:GO, like, at the Grid Finder office, Nikhil, Liam, and Camille, they all love CS:GO, and I see them watching it, and they'll watch a whole round because it's only like a couple of minutes, right? So you can stay focused on it. So sim racing has that challenge, and I think ESLR1 especially is at least exploring and being creative with ways to try and tackle that.
Yeah, the thing is a bit, like, you could go deeper on that, because so racing just in general doesn't have this same chance to do similar story arcs. Like in Counter-Strike, if you lose a round, it doesn't mean at all losing the map, right? You can always recover. You make your eco round or another one, and then you're roughly level again, same chances. And in sim racing, once the race has progressed, once you're P5 and you're 3 seconds down, there's no reset anymore, right? They can make a reset after the race and do another race or so, but it's impossible to change something in the race without starting to kind of integrate sort of artificial elements, right? We talked to them at ESL, for example, just trying to be creative with what you could do, right? You could give everyone a chance to fit 3 options to their car, like use more fuel for a lap, or get a new tire set across the start finish line or so, right? And just get those things like you have in League of Legends, where you build your set for that game or something, or in Counter-Strike, which weapons you pick and grenades and whatever, just to give the player more impact and maybe another strategical thing. But then we have this whole BOP topic, and this is going to just stir it up to infinity. So probably this is going to make it all worse. So it's very tricky to get sim racing to be as entertaining, in the sense that chances stay alive until the very end, right? In Counter-Strike, you can lead 14-0 and you can still lose the map. It's 14 or 7 or 8, whatever, right? And that in sim racing, it just doesn't happen. If you're a lap down, you're freaking lap down. Not everybody's going to fail. And you also just don't have one enemy in that race, but 20 or 40 or 50. And you need all of them to screw up to get your chances back. So it's much more brutal in terms of, if you make one error, there's no recovery.
Yeah, and I suppose that's even more like poignant at a local event. So for us at the last race, especially, which was Spa, obviously we traveled to Spa. We had the whole team go out there. So we had, I think it was like 7 or 8 of us. We had a big Airbnb. Everyone we'd flown across from the UK. It was a Spa 24 hours. It was an incredible experience, and obviously Leon had practiced for hours and hours and hours and hours, got the setup right, done the qualifying right, and then in the race somebody got hit him from behind, span him round, and then that was the chance of points gone. I mean, he managed to get back from last to 16th, so 1 position away from getting points, which was frustrating. But obviously it's a huge kind of expense emotionally to get to that point, and then just have 1 chance when you're there. Like, it would be great. They could do 3 half-an-hour races rather than like a long qualifying.
And I think the viewers know that, right? There is no magical recovery. You're not going from last to first, just not happening, right? Whereas in CSGO, that can literally happen. You go from losing 2 maps to still winning the best of 5.
Yeah,
which is just an insane turnaround, and it can just switch several times in an event. But it's just, I don't see how that would possibly work in sim racing yet. I see ESL trying, but it comes at a great cost of player happiness there, because whatever you do, it's out of your hands. And in Counter Strike, the target is to kill the other guy. In sim racing, it's an option to win, right? And that is so different, right? You're in sim racing, you have to kind of play with and against your opponents at the same time. You still kind of have to agree of how much aggression each of them brings to the table. And in Counter Strike, of course, it's maximum aggression. Like the target is to knock him out.
No one will criticize you for killing the opponent.
Yes, exactly, right? You can go as far as the game allows every single time. In sim racing, there's always, there's this option to go further and further and kind of stretch the limit, and then it's brutal.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because there is another parallel there with real world racing, in that you kind of have to be smart. Like if your overall goal is to be a successful driver, right? So racing driver, and let's just assume that includes sim or real, right? And that's what you want to do. You could do it by winning races, by being super aggressive and knocking people off the track. But then when the community is discussing who's the best driver, you're unlikely to get listed, because you're known as this person who's just very aggressive and unfair and knocking your rivals off the track. It's like the Max Verstappen debate. Is he here because he's always very like elbows out and all the drivers give him extra room, or is that actually really smart? And it's
and we're not going into that.
No. I don't know. We have a rule on this podcast: we don't talk about F1.
Yeah, no. Gonna make spicy comments.
Absolutely not. We can clip them up. Okay, so let's carry on with the story. So you've won your first tournament. Was that the point at which you were hooked and had decided, this is what I'm going to do full time, or was there another route?
I mean, nah. So back then there was no chance to do that full time, because the prize money we had was like, if it went really well and you won all races in the season plus the final, was like 1,500. So that was big waste of time.
Yeah.
But of course, it got me set up with just getting my senses sharp for sim racing in general. So this is where it all began. But of course, again, it wasn't an option back then. So just went to school and studied and all that. And it really took until 2017 or 18 or something, where a friend of mine was working in esports in general. So he was at G2 managing all the teams pretty much, like in a really center position in the organization. And he was a sim racer back then with me when we were 17 or something. And he's 5 years younger or something. So, and he won that BMW M6 famously back then. So one of the biggest prizes we had at the times was the Intel Racing Tour together with BMW and the Sauber of one team. And they made that on Live for Speed, and he won that race. So he got the car. Was 17, couldn't drive it, sold it. But yeah, he was staying in esports, and in 2017-18 sim racing got a bit of a boost because F1 was going in that direction. They had the F1 esports season. The first one was 16-17 or something, so there were eyeballs and was all picking up a little. Was also the time of was it already for the first Formula E Las Vegas race around that time, 2019, 20 or so. Yeah. So it all got going a bit. And he just sent me a link to the E Race of Champions competition at that time. And he was like, this is something for you. He said, I'm like, yeah, okay, I have a little time on my hands. Let's try it. So I qualified for that final in Mexico. And that got me back into the scene a little. And then G2 was starting to get closer with Red Bull, and they had the Red Bull Racing F1 esports team. And then that got managed by G2, and he didn't really have enough time on his hands. So we shared that position. So he asked me, do you kind of want to do that? And like, weird story arc, right? Because doing all the studies and blah, 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 preparing to work in economics or marketing or whatever. And suddenly there's the sim racing thing, what was still a passion. I just said yes at the end of the day, and then things took their way.
That's nuts. It's nuts. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's another story that I've heard of somebody getting into sim racing through that very early, very close knit community. Because I think sim racing in 2015, 2016, especially, was a very tight community. Because before that, there wasn't a huge scene. Now, like diehard kind of PC gamers who played Live for Speed, etc., will say, "No, sim racing did exist. You just didn't know about it." Like, but actually, the sim racing as we know it now, I feel like 2015, 2016 is where it really started to grow, and there seemed to be this very close knit community of people all working very much together to try and put sim racing up onto the stage. And all those people within that community have now gone on to take all these kind of very high profile positions, right?
It must have been something like that. Who were there all the early days? Where just the people were approached, right? Because nobody else really knew the scene or so. So yeah, that's, I guess, just a naturally how it really goes. And there was never a CV sent. There were no applications made. You would just approach like, we need help here.
Yeah.
So suddenly you're kind of consultant just because you're in that scene, and it became interesting for bigger brands, and they didn't know their ways in there. So I know at one point we were interviewed by a big agency in Germany, like Jung von Matt, for example. I think they do a lot of high profile marketing campaigns for the big companies in Germany, and I guess they were tasked with finding out what sim racing is and what the big companies could do in there. So they were approaching us and just interviewed us for hours and hours to get a grasp of the whole thing. Can argue how well that went, but
that must have been a very surreal experience. Because it's like when you said about applications, like you wouldn't see a job description as like minimum of 3 to 4 years experience as a sim racing consultant, because like the role didn't exist. It's very much, to use a cheesy word, essentially trailblazing a whole new sector of gaming.
Yeah, and nobody really shaped those positions. There was just tasks to be done, and they were very broadly, like it's like the whole specialization and breaking up tasks or putting more tasks into more precise actual positions. I think that came later, because in the beginning it just needed managing whatever there was, and it wasn't clear yet what that would eventually be. So we just did everything in a single position, and only over time budgets grew and maybe sponsors got more interested, blah blah. And then you only later had the chance to actually form positions in that space. So now you have talent managers, or then you have the partner managers or marketing managers.
And you have companies like Veloce that have grown themselves on managing esports teams for, McLaren and Ferrari, and it's
not talk about them too much, maybe, because there's a lot of background story going on where things are not as nice, to say the least.
Yeah, we will move on from that.
Let's say from a business perspective, they did a lot of good moves from maybe ethical point of view or player exploitation point of view, not so much.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole podcast to be had about Veloce, because it's a fascinating organization, and they're what they're doing with
Didn't
Vex
they just launch a weird NFT crypto thing where you're like, what the actual is that?
Yeah. I'm going to stay very neutral, because I'd love to have Veloce on the podcast to get their perspective on, especially the Vex thing, because it's funny that it's called Vexed, because it has vexed me as to like why, like what I don't. Anyway, yeah, we will we'll move on from that. So you're at G2.
You get them on board, ask them firsthand.
Yeah. Okay, so you're at G2, and would you say this is the first time where you kind of saw sim racing as an industry that is getting to a point where it could potentially support a full-time career?
Because I always was skeptical, because I knew that, or I had the feeling that whatever these big brands were expecting in sim racing or trying to achieve, I always felt to a degree that I thought I knew. Sim racing would never have this kind of size of audience, right? There would be players. So if you made a game, you'd certainly sell a lot, not a problem. But it's just like how we spoke earlier, it's just not as an audience sport because of the long story arc. The race is taking too long, and people do sim racing, and I'm just convinced it's this way. People do sim racing because they are fascinated by the real thing, and they can't get that because it's too expensive and whatever. Sim racing is the closest they can get, and their target is playing. And some might breathe it so much that they also watch the broadcasts and all that. But I think the majority of people is there to play, and I feel this is different just maybe because there's just a whole lot more people in Counter-Strike and League of Legends. But I think these are also more suitable to be like watch only sports, right? A lot of people watch football or soccer, but don't actually play, right? And I think that's the same for me. When I was in G2, I just watched a bit of League of Legends, but I didn't play a single game, but I could still watch it. And I think in sim racing, it's different. You're playing it and might watch it, but I think it's very rare that people watch it without playing themselves.
Yeah. Well, because
so I
they
always
have an
thought
option
that
they have an option to watch either virtual racing or real racing.
also that, right? You pretty much have the the opponent in terms of fighting for viewership in loads of real series and things being more attractive potentially. But then again, sim racing has that advantage that you can get much closer to the drivers, the players. You can touch the characters, so to say, by being in the POV feeds, which you just don't have in the real car. Imagine like being a camera on the windscreen facing towards the driver without a helmet, and then you'd see all the expressions and all that, right? But it's impossible in the real thing to get across that. I think until you have very small cameras in the helmet, maybe, and lit faces in the helmet, you get the point. It's difficult to do in the real thing. So sim racing has an advantage there, where you can just be closer to what the person feels throughout a race, which is much more down to interpretation in Formula One, because all you get is filtered radio messages.
Yeah. But I mean, I thought that, and again, not to break our rules on F1, but I actually really enjoyed it when they were playing all the messages between the drivers and then the team managers to the drivers, team managers to the stewards. Like, that's the most behind the curtain I think we've ever seen. And it was fascinating. But of course, you have a producer in a studio picking out which messages to play to essentially his job or her job is to tell a story. And so they're going to pick out the bits which make for the best story, not necessarily tell the kind of numerical metric, black and white, this is what's happening in the race.
Yeah. And then so I had this feeling or conviction that in sim racing, you'll never grow audiences enough for the investment of these brands to actually make sense financially, unless they are able to keep luring partners into the space, right? So or kind of cross-selling with whatever they have, right? And I know in the big Formula One teams, they have audience and they can always tap into that. So if they make a deal around their esports team, they can always say, look, we can always tie this into the real thing. In this way, increase the reach a lot. And but then again, I think in F1 esports, we've seen the follower base of some of the players. Looking at Jano, for example, is insane. Like, he's probably one of the biggest streamers, full stop.
Yeah.
Even if he does not sim racing, but just it's the same realm, right? He does the F1 game, and people flock to his stream in thousands, 10,000 if he does a PSGL race. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So I might have been wrong there, but it all concentrates on so few players that as an ecosystem, it's not spreading out to everyone.
But I think that the interesting thing is that if he does a PSGL race, his stream will get more viewership than the PSGL stream, because people are interested in the streamer, not necessarily the sim racing spectacle, which actually is a bit of a shame, because if you look at the commentators that they've had, especially when you look at George Morgan and how good he is, like the streams were fantastic. Like, they were really enjoyable to watch. But I think even George is moving on to real world
viewer
racing.
immersion is just much better when you can stay with one person, and people seem to rather want to live through that individual story arc of a race, positive or negative, rather than seeing the race as a whole.
Yeah.
Right? They have more affiliation with a player than with a race in total. They're still going to compliment if somebody else wins, but they want to, feel what Jano feels.
Yeah, and that is interesting, because that is sim racing's advantage over real world racing, and perhaps that's what we should be focusing on the most. If viewership is the goal, which I actually am very much in your camp, that I've always argued that sim racing is about participation, not viewership, because
Mm-hmm.
in terms of participation, it's incredible because it's so immersive and you have wheels and pedals and it feels completely
Yeah.
different to any other game. But from a viewer's point of view, if you want to watch F1 esports or F1, you just watch F1.
They would be smart to just offer player feeds in F1 esports as well, but own and brand them.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Right? I think that would perfectly work because they're already grabbing the feed of the players in F1 esports. Even if they do it online, they're still grabbing the screen and they're grabbing the camera. So they could, in theory, use that. And I personally think they should also just stream directly to the players' channels. And then you can make an agreement around that, right? Then they have the partner images or whatever they need, they can put on there. But I think it would be, I don't know, it would be technically more, from a technical perspective, more advanced, probably harder to handle, and more streams to monitor and make sure it's all working. But still, I think from viewer perspective, people would appreciate that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I look at the work that people like Mike Yao at SRO does, and his iRacing streams, his ACC streams are absolutely fantastic. The picture in picture, the bringing up of webcams of the drivers in their bedrooms while they're racing, it's getting better. But if you look at the kit that Mike has to achieve it, that's not your average league race isn't going to be able to achieve that.
That's very true. So yeah, but as you say, we've now talked about several people, and they all have full-time sim racing jobs, so to say, right? And at the time, for me, it just was shaping to be one. While I did a lot of different stuff, probably at the beginning, it took way more time than it paid, but we kept increasing that over the years. And then at G2/Red Bull Racing, it just was my full-time job. But it was also very, very exhausting. Player management in the end, especially when remotely, is just tricky, especially when they're younger and you don't have good access to the people when they're somewhere else. And so yeah, it takes a lot of energy. And eventually I started my own driving more intensively again, and that worked out. And then suddenly I was driving for BMW within G2 and all that. So it just, I don't know, I had to make a choice at some point because it was only going to be one or the other, but hardly both, just because both needed full time.
Yeah.
And at some point I just chose to seek the direction of going for the driving side of things more, at least, than the management part. Also because that's the only thing I can really scale, right? With the software we've developed, or with the streaming and YouTube, you can kind of invest the same amount of time, but at some point when it's big enough, it just pays more. And then if you're in a paid per hour position, that's the end of the road, so to say. And of course, I was trying to get more because I don't know how long Simmering is going to be there and how long I'm going to be able to do it. So the attempt is to make sure in a shorter time frame to put myself in a position that's comfortable.
Interesting. So tell us about popometer then, or popometer. I hear it pronounced different ways, like popometer, popometer. We'll go with popometer. But tell us where the idea came from, and then when you decided to give it a crack.
So I always had this coaching approach, right? Helping people how to drive, and in the coachings itself, I always relied on Motec. And then I only have so many hours in the day, and I had quite a few requests for the coaches, and I basically couldn't handle it. And so then at some point I aligned with RST, that software, so racing sim tools that already existed. And Zach back then implemented the feature of being able for me to upload data there for people to compare the telemetry. But in the end, I had much more ideas of what I wanted to do with that, and I needed more flexibility and this and that. And in the end, it was just because he had a full-time job already as an engineer, and he was doing the software at the side that just couldn't quite agree on the direction, because it was his baby, the software. So I didn't have enough say in it, which is fair. So at some point, just decided to do something on our own because I still knew a very good programmer from back at the for Speed days.
Nice.
And he's doing full-time programming. So I was able to convince him to start doing the code for what I had in my mind as what the platform should be, which is still not quite there where I want it to be, but we're making, like, it's a functioning product right now. And he made that all by himself, essentially. And just in terms of what we can do with it and just expanding on our own ideas and blah, blah, that's much better having your own thing than working with someone who has very different ideas of the whole thing. So that's kind of how it was born. Of course, we saw how people were looking for setups and all that, but I felt it never was solely about the setups, because it just gives people the security that, or the reassurance that the issue is in the driving. Right? You can buy setups as much as you want. You're limited in the end by your capabilities. And I was always about helping people to build on that, because much more time is buried in better driving. And I know how much time I've put in and all the other good guys have put in, and taking shortcuts, so to say, through those learning hours by looking at what somebody else really does and having that visualized, rather than going through the replay and stopping and going slow motion and going back and forward. It's much better to just have the whole lab in front of you in a 2D way, so to say, in terms of data, and look at that and try to understand what somebody really does different. I know it's a lot of information, and we still have to develop ways to narrow it down for people, to not leave them alone as much with the interpretation of that data, right? Seeing it is one thing, understanding it is another, putting it into practice is a whole nother thing. So we're still working on making it easier for people to extract that information, or just outright throw it at them, what the differences are, what they mean, what they need to read from that, and put into their practice.
And how do you feel about the growth of these AI setup and coaching tools in sim racing? So you've got Trophy.ai and Track Titan are the two that I know that have raised. Both of them have raised millions of dollars in investment to build this AI on-screen tool that will help you get faster.
They're certainly better at attracting money, I can tell you that. But the product itself, I'm not so sure, because of course we thought about that, right? We like my programmer, he works for an investor, and of course we talked to him as well, and he immediately came, okay, we have lots of data, put it into an AI, it's going to spit out the right thing. I was like, tricky. Because during my studies, which was economics, I was focusing on the impact of new technology on economics. And therefore, you have to understand that technology to judge what capacity it has to fundamentally change the next business cycle or bigger cycle in economics. And so I looked into this AI stuff, and I worked at a company in Germany that is developing AI stuff. And they're quite advanced worldwide. They never appear as relevant. But for example, all the video codecs you use are from them. Like the H.264 has been co-developed there, for example, and the H.265, for example, right? So they are pretty advanced. And just working there, we put a lot of effort into kind of opening that AI black box and helping people understand what actually happens underneath. And so I was kind of in a good position to tell that investor, well, it's great, but it's just not going to deliver what we are seeking, at least at the time. I mean, we're talking 5 years ago or something. And of course, AI improved a lot, and you can rely on it much more, and whatever it throws out, and it's more deliberate and not as, the input doesn't define as much the output, right? There's more going on now. But still, I wouldn't feed the AI a bunch of data and then be confident that it would spit out useful setup information, because we have so many influential factors. Like we have, at least 50 settings we can dial in with at least 50 positions. So that's already 2,500 options, potential settings, how they interplay with how the car is shaped. And then you have the driver driving it, and then you get a whole lot of more possible data points that influence the lap time in the end, which is what you're trying to achieve. So I think it's just too many different data points that would have an influence, and you'd need, if you have so many variables, you need to scale the amount of data you feed in till infinity, basically. I don't think SimRace is big enough for that.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I asked the same question 2 weeks ago to Jorrit, who runs Sim Racing Center. Now they sell Formula One setups, and they're incredibly successful. And I asked him the same question, and he said that the biggest issue with AI is that it will never be able to take into account the driver's own style and how that impacts the setups. Otherwise, every game would just have a meta setup. Everyone would just have, well, this is the perfect setup for this car on this track, like fact. But because every driver drives differently, it will affect what style of setup. And then there's drivers who, based on their driving style as it is, that they don't even know they have, there is a perfect setup, but they would probably prefer a suboptimal setup because they're more comfortable with it, even though they would be faster with another one. Yeah. And you couldn't possibly know where that sliding scale is.
And it's also just so tricky because you have, in the end, talking ACC, you have these JSON files, and there's just numbers in there. And first, you need to tell the things to interpret these numbers as what they are, a position on a slider. Maybe, right, it would just see a spring being left or right or 0 or 10, but it wouldn't understand soft or stiff, for example, and the impact it has on all other settings and car behavior. It would just look at the number and see, is the lap time faster or not in that individual case. And I just don't see that automatically leading to, for example, the setups that everybody's driving right now, because they're essentially exploiting the physics. And maybe if there were a lot of lap times that are fast driven with such setups, then maybe the AI would understand the correlation. But then we'd already also have that setup, and the AI would just confirm what we already know. So it's not like, right? It's very weird. Like, maybe you drive a fast lap with a soft front spring, and maybe instead you also drive a fast lap with a stiff rear spring, for example. And then the AI will learn, soft front and stiff rear is good. Let's do both, and then you can't drive anymore.
Yeah.
So, I'm torn on that. And maybe some of those AI tools that help you with setup suggestions aren't actually AI, but just kind of have a huge amount of if and then.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think they're both, from what I can see from their product and their marketing, I think they're moving more from setup to coaching, as in you have an on-screen coach of brake later, be softer, get closer to the apex, accelerate earlier, blah, 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 more curb here, less curb there, which could work if there is a generally perfect lap and they can feed in data from your aliens who are doing all the best times, and then they can just simply compare your lap with their lap in terms of where you physically put the car on the track. Maybe there's something there.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're doing, right? Just the question is just, where would we actually need AI? Like, we can approach this whole thing in a descriptive manner, just looking for certain things, because we don't actually need to look at the whole thing and kind of try to get the AI to tell the right thing, because I, as a coach, know the right thing. I can read this data, I can read these patterns, and I can tell the driver what the thing is that they're looking for. And just taking all that, I know there's like 10, 20 different mistakes people make. There isn't an endless amount, so to say. Of course, there are recombinations and all that, but you can pretty much narrow down for 90% of use cases what everybody does wrong. So it doesn't need this AI in the background to find the secret error.
I guess it's an alternative to, because and again, Jorrit was saying that he believes that a human coach is a lot better and it's a lot more enjoyable as an experience. And a lot of racers, they're getting coaching again for immersion because they just want to race with other people who are faster. A lot of people who get coaching don't necessarily want to be esports pros. They just want to be in a higher tier, and having a coach is immersive, and you build up a relationship, and it's a far more enjoyable experience. I guess the AI coaches would argue that their product is scalable because all you have to do is turn it on before you go, and then you get these on-screen prompts, and it talks to you whilst you're going around, and so you can, from a business point of view, they could coach, in theory, 1
Yeah.
billion people every hour. Whereas obviously, if you have a coaching company of 100 people,
Yeah.
you can only coach 100. So it's really interesting. It's going to be a really interesting space to watch from.
No, for me,
my
it's just to
perspective.
serve different pocket sizes, right? If there's people who have 10K rigs at home, they get really invested in sim racing and they lack the speed, so then they come to me and invest another €100, which is very little, to actually drive decently. And of course, then there are people who are much less affluent with the money, so they need cheaper options, and that's then where I see my platform, for example, just giving people a chance to still do that comparison, but kind of do them assisted or on their own without an actual person in there, or at least with less time spent by a person. Like we're still planning things where we will allow people to just say, hey, this lap against this pro lap, can you give me a brief analysis of the lap or so, until we're confident that we could just have that run automatically by the software. But I think until then, you can just always have a coach look briefly over it, highlight the 3, 4, 5 areas or something in, say, 15 minutes, and then you pay 15 minutes, not the whole hour or 1.5, whatever the coaching is.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's really cool. And I'm gonna go and have a look at Popometer again after this this podcast. But okay, so we're getting towards the end of the time that we've got, and we have some questions from our community. We're going to start doing this every episode. So if you enjoy these podcasts and you want to ask questions for our guests, then make sure you're in our Discord server or in our Facebook group, and we announce the guest the day before, and we give people a opportunity to ask questions. So we've had a few questions in, and I've chosen
nice
2 that I'm going to ask. One of them really made me laugh, the way that it was the way that it was written, and I might share this later. But Mickey Schmidt says he is an e-race junkie from the first PlayStation. 1997 was a nice year. Wink face, wink face, wink face. This guy's having a great day at this point, I think. RUF and GT and Nordschleife. So I've got perfect sound and a Neo QLED. What's your ideas for my first kit? So he's giving you options, right? What would you prioritize first? A PC, so moving away from PlayStation, a proper rig, or the steering system? What do you think? I guess I could probably boil that question down, because there's a lot in there, to be like, what's the most important thing, do you think, for a sim racer to upgrade or buy first?
So if he's planning to go all the way anyway, and he's just asking me what the first step would be, then I would probably say, well, it depends how far he goes and what he already has. But anyway, I'll just go with the steering wheel and pedals, because that's how you put information in the game, what you want of the car. And you can put that on the PlayStation as well, right? And if you later update to PC, you can still use that wheel, so it wouldn't be wasted money. But if you get a PC now and have to drive with your same old shitty pedals, for example, you wouldn't get the better experience. You'd just be on a different platform. So I'd say start with a steering wheel and pedals, and then if you still enjoy the Gran Turismo kind of thing on the PlayStation, or Forza if you're on Xbox, then stay with that and get the rig, and then the PC in the last step. But you'll have to probably face the PC people telling you that you're not doing a real sim. So it depends how much you can cope with that.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There's almost like there's two paths here. But the good news is that the hardware is getting more and more compatible with consoles, and that's becoming a bit more of a target versus PC. I guess you then get limited if you go console versus PC to you can't use mods, and you can't use additional plugins or crew chief or Popometer and blah 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 blah. So yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe for me, if I was answering that question, I'd probably be like, if you're going to do it and you want to go long term, make that first big investment. in
They're
your
gonna all
tower.
come anyway. That doesn't matter
It's
where you start, you're gonna
inevitable.
make them all.
It's a slow march towards just being on a lifetime of that GPU upgrade train that you'll never be able to avoid.
It's
Um,
yeah, it is the case.
Okay, we have a second question from Strovic, who's a big fan of the podcast. He's kind of getting involved in all of our episodes, which we really appreciate. So thanks, Strovic, for enjoying and listening to and enjoying the podcast. He asks, what websites do you go to most often within the sim racing world to connect with us as others and feel a sense of community?
Oh, it's probably so I'm busy, okay, and I don't have much time to scroll through forums and read something like that. So I'm more of I do more output than I get input, I think. So if I do a YouTube video, I try to stay really close to the comments. Right, if people comment on my YouTube, I try to make sure to answer everyone that reasonably answers himself. So if you just trash talk, I might just ignore it. But most of the people, I'll really try to engage in the conversation in the YouTube comments, and that's where I get the sense of community. But then, of course, I have the Discord, 6,000 people or something. I don't know. Much less are actually writing, but of course, that's the standard place where I'm just there. This is just open when I'm here at home, which I am most of the time. So yeah, that I'd be approachable there. I engage with other people, and yeah, I think I don't watch them as others anymore. Right, on my Discord, there's a couple people who are just really close by now, and then I don't think there's a third bit really. So it's YouTube and it's Discord.
That's
And
interesting.
I'm checking Reddit every now and then, but I'm more seeing Reddit as an opportunity to just put myself out there rather than
Mm.
getting input, right? It's just a different audience there. I think I have more to give there than to take.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Discord seems to have I was going to say killed, but not killed because that sounds really negative, as if it's a bad thing. But the forum
It's more
style
instant.
sites seem to have suffered since Discord's come out, because now you can have your super targeted mini communities that you can shape as you want, rather than being subject to however that particular forum wants to shape their discussions.
It's also just much more direct, and you kind of make sure somebody can see what you're writing. In the forum, it's always down to someone reading your post while it's on top or something, right? And if more pages come, then you're already missing that. I hate the way Reddit sorts comments. Like, I sometimes,
Bizarre, isn't it?
I'm just like, okay, wasn't it like recent? Why is it not visible? And then it's
Yeah,
very weird.
it's well, yeah. I mean, because do they not use the you can sort, right? And I think it's either newest or hottest, and whatever the algorithm is for hottest,
Yeah,
which I think is default. Like who the hell knows?
yeah, or the like 20 layers deep into a response or so, it just gets hard to have an overview or so. But the same on Twitter. I don't know what it does anymore. I'm getting zero
X
notifications from Twitter. I don't get it. Yeah, I'm not
X.
following that. Yeah, he's gonna have a harder time convincing me of that.
Yeah,
So
it's
yeah,
also
on
horrible
Twitter
because
it's weird.
before you say I read a tweet or I saw some tweets, it's really hard now to say I saw some X's. It just doesn't roll off the tongue as much.
Yeah, I think a lot that he's doing does not make sense. Like
But he's having a lot of fun doing it.
I'm not too sure. Like if he looks at what he spent and what he has to get in, it's not going too well.
No. Okay. Well, Nils, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming onto the podcast. Really, really appreciate it. If people want to find you online or follow you, where should they go?
Twitter, Discord, YouTube.
Easy. Perfect. And anything that we should be looking out for on Popometer anytime soon?
Yeah, I think we're like we've started with something, so we're trying to really go in the direction of helping people get assistance with what they read out of the data. So we're trying to put more things there where like sort of analysis is being done by the platform and helping you understand what you need to look at most, instead of leaving you alone with all the interpretation of the data. So I think that's probably going to be in terms of product value, going to be the first kind of game changer, hopefully.
Nice. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing it. And by the way, our sim racing team, they all use Popometer and they all absolutely love it. So big shout out for that. But Nils, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. And we'll chat soon.
Likewise.
Okay, so that was Nils from BS Competition, BMW Sim Racing, formerly of G2, founder of Popometer, a guy who really, really knows his sim racing, as you'll have gathered, and also a really nice guy to talk to. So, thank you, Nils, for joining us on the podcast. I was really interested to hear your thoughts on your own product. Obviously, we're building our league manager over here at Gridfinder, so it's always nice to speak to people who are trying to build for the community in sim racing and how viable it is and how we can kind of keep these products alive and grow the space that we love. So thanks Nils again for joining us. And final thanks to our new sponsor, Aztec Sim Sports. Appreciate you having faith in our podcast, and we're looking forward to working with you and getting some people on the show and trying out your equipment over the next few months. So thank you, Aztec. You'll have heard in that episode that we're going to try and get questions from the community into the episode. So if you want the notification, the heads up of who the guest is going to be, I usually send it out the day before we're recording. I'll tell you who it is, and I'll offer you the opportunity to ask them some questions. If you want to get involved in that, make sure you're in the Gridfinder Discord. And check out the Sim Sundays podcast channel in there, or join the Gridfinder Facebook group. Okay, see you next time.